His name was Norman Cota. Brigadier General Norman Cota, and if you had passed him on the streets of wartime London in early 1944, you might not have noticed him at all. He was 51 years old, with a lean face and steady gray eyes, the kind of officer who listened more than he spoke, who preferred studying terrain maps and lamplight to making grand pronouncements at headquarters meetings. Cota had spent months preparing for this invasion, this leap across the English Channel that everyone simply called D-Day, and he knew something that kept him awake on those cool spring nights, something that gnawed at the edges of every planning session. The beaches were going to be chaos. All the careful plans, all the rehearsals on the cold shores of southern England, all the briefings and models and photographs taken by reconnaissance planes flying low over the French coast, none of it could truly predict what would happen when 30,000 men tried to storm ashore under German fire. And one beach worried him more than the others. They called it Omaha Beach, a stretch of sand and stone beneath high bluffs in Normandy, and the intelligence reports made it clear that this would be the hardest landing of all, the place where the invasion could fail before it truly began. The German defenses there were formidable, concrete bunkers embedded in the hillside, machine gun nests with overlapping fields of fire, barbed wire and wooden obstacles scattered across the tidal flats, and thousands of mines buried in the sand and shingle. The plan called for the first wave of infantry to land at dawn, supported by amphibious tanks that would swim ashore and provide covering fire, and Cota had seen the training exercises, had watched young soldiers practice storming beaches again and again, their faces serious beneath their helmets. But he had also seen them falter, seen them freeze when the blanks were fired and the smoke grenades billowed across the sand, and he knew that the real thing would be infinitely worse. So in those final weeks, while other generals focused on the grand strategy, on the movement of divisions and the placement of reserves, Norman Cota focused on something smaller, something that might seem almost trivial in the context of the largest amphibious invasion in history. He focused on leadership at the very tip of the spear. He began visiting the camps where the assault troops trained, walking among them without fanfare, sitting with young lieutenants and captains and asking them quiet questions about their plans, about what they would do if the landing went wrong, if their radios failed, if their officers were killed in the first minutes. And in those conversations, in that patient, careful preparation, the seeds were planted for what would happen on June 6th. When everything did go wrong, and one general's foresight made all the difference. Outside the tent where Cota worked late into the evening, the English countryside lay quiet under spring stars, and in the distance, if you listened carefully, you could hear the faint rumble of aircraft engines, the endless stream of bombers heading east toward occupied Europe, their sound gradually fading into the darkness like a promise, or a warning. The problem with Omaha Beach was simple to state, and seemingly impossible to solve. The beach was roughly 6 miles long, shaped like a gentle crescent, with the English Channel to the north, and steep bluffs rising up to the south, bluffs that gave the German defenders perfect views of every approach, every yard of sand where American soldiers would have to cross. At low tide, the beach stretched wide and exposed, 400 yards of open ground with no cover, and the tide came in fast on that coast. So the timing of the landing was crucial. Catch it wrong and men would drown in deep water. Catch it right, and they'd still have hundreds of yards to cross under fire. The planners had done everything they could think of to help. There would be a massive naval bombardment just before dawn, battleships and cruisers firing thousands of shells at the German positions, trying to destroy the bunkers and gun emplacements before the first soldiers set foot on French soil. There would be aerial bombing too, hundreds of heavy bombers dropping their payloads on the bluffs in the darkness before dawn, turning the beach defenses into rubble, or so the plan hoped. And there would be those amphibious tanks, special Sherman tanks fitted with flotation screens, designed to swim through the waves and arrive on the beach alongside the infantry, providing mobile firepower when it was needed most. But Norman Cota had his doubts. He had seen the reconnaissance photographs, studied them under magnifying glasses in rooms thick with cigarette smoke, and he knew that even if everything went perfectly, even if the bombardment destroyed half the German defenses, the beach would still be a killing ground. And if things went wrong, if the bombardment missed, if the tanks sank in the rough seas, if the first waves were pinned down and couldn't move forward, then the entire invasion could stall at Omaha. The men would be trapped between the water and the bluffs, with nowhere to hide and nowhere to advance, and wave after wave of reinforcements would pile up behind them, creating a catastrophe that could doom the whole operation. This is what kept Cota awake at night, this vision of failure, this nightmare scenario that he could see so clearly in his mind. But rather than simply worry, he began to think about solutions, not grand strategic solutions, but small, practical ones, the kind of solutions that might actually work when everything else fell apart. He began to focus on the exits. The bluffs weren't completely impassable. There were 5 natural draws, 5 small valleys that cut through the high ground, and if the troops could reach these draws and fight their way up, they could get off the beach and into the hedgerow country beyond, where the battle would become more equal. But reaching the draws would require initiative. It would require small groups of men to keep moving forward even when pinned down, to find their own way when communication broke down, to lead themselves when their officers were casualties. And this, Cota realized, was something he could actually influence, not through grand planning, but through preparation and example, through making sure that every soldier who landed on Omaha Beach understood one simple truth. There was only one way to survive, and that was to move forward. The spring rain pattered softly against the windows of the briefing room, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its sound carrying across the sleeping English countryside, marking the passage of time toward that fast approaching dawn. As May turned to June, as the weather remained gray and uncertain over the channel, Norman Cota made his final preparations. He had been assigned to the 29th Infantry Division, a unit that would land in the first wave at Omaha Beach, and he spent those last days moving among the men, from camp to camp, battalion to battalion, company to company. He didn't give speeches, that wasn't his way. Instead, he simply talked with the soldiers, asked them questions, listened to their concerns, and quietly, almost casually, he told them what to expect. He told them the landing would be hard, that the plan would probably fall apart, that they might find themselves alone and leaderless in the first minutes, surrounded by smoke and noise and confusion. And then he told them what to do about it. Keep moving, that was the essential message. Keep moving forward no matter what. Don't stop on the beach. Don't wait for orders. Find the gaps in the defenses and push through them. He made them memorize the locations of those 5 draws, those 5 exits through the bluffs, and he told them that reaching those draws was the only thing that mattered, more important than keeping formation, more important than waiting for support, more important than anything else. Some of the younger officers listened with wide eyes, trying to imagine what Cota was describing, trying to picture themselves leading men through that kind of chaos. Others, the veterans who had seen combat in North Africa or Sicily, simply nodded. They understood what was coming, they had seen plans collapse before, and they appreciated that at least one general was being honest with them. In those final briefings, Cota also made another decision, one that would prove crucial on D-Day. He decided that he would land with the first wave. This was unusual. Generals typically came ashore after the beach was secure, after the initial assault troops had carved out a safe perimeter, but Cota knew that Omaha Beach wouldn't be secure in the first hours. It would be a desperate struggle, and he wanted to be there. Not to take command, the beach would be too chaotic for any one person to control, but to serve as an example, to show the men that even a general believed the only way off that beach was forward. His staff officers tried to talk him out of it, reminded him that his presence in the initial wave was against protocol, that if he was killed the division would lose its assistant commander, but Cota was quiet and firm in his decision. He would go in with the 29th, with the 116th Infantry Regiment specifically, and he would do what he could when the moment came. The men who knew about this decision, the company commanders and battalion staff, felt something shift in their understanding of what was about to happen. If a general was willing to land on that beach in the first wave, then perhaps it could be done. Perhaps courage wasn't just about following orders but about choosing to be where the danger was greatest. On the evening of June 5th, the invasion finally began, the vast armada of ships slipping out of English ports in the twilight, their hulls dark against the grey water, thousands of vessels carrying thousands of men toward the coast of France. And somewhere in that fleet, Norman Cota stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the English coastline fade behind him, feeling the salt spray on his face, and thinking about tomorrow, about that beach, about those young men who would need leadership when everything fell apart. The wake of the ship glowed faintly in the darkness, and overhead, the first stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant, and utterly indifferent to what was coming. Dawn came slowly on D-Day, the sky lightening from black to gray, revealing a sea that was rougher than anyone had hoped, with waves that pitched the landing craft violently as they circled offshore, waiting for the signal to begin their run toward the beach. Norman Cota descended into his landing craft in the pre-dawn darkness, along with the soldiers of the 116th Infantry, young men from Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania, many of them seasick from the rough crossing, all of them silent with tension and fear and anticipation. The bombardment had already begun, the battleships offshore firing their great guns toward the bluffs, the sound rolling across the water like continuous thunder, and in the darkness they could see flashes of orange light where the shells struck the French coast. It looked devastating. It looked like nothing could survive such a bombardment, and for a moment Cota allowed himself to hope that perhaps the landing would be easier than expected. But as their landing craft began its run toward shore, as the gray light grew stronger and the beach became visible ahead, that hope faded. The bombardment had missed. The shells had fallen too far inland, or had simply failed to destroy the concrete bunkers, and as the first wave of landing craft approached the beach, the German guns opened fire. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, machine guns chattering from multiple positions, the air above the water suddenly full of tracer rounds and the crack of bullets passing close, and men began falling even before the ramps dropped. Cota's landing craft grounded on a sandbar about 50 yards from shore, the ramp dropped, and he stepped into chest-deep water under fire. Around him, the beach was already chaos. Tanks were burning, some had sunk in the deep water, others had been hit as they emerged onto the sand, and their crews were swimming or drowning in the surf. Bodies floated in the shallows, equipment drifted loose, and everywhere men were trying to find cover behind the beach obstacles, the wooden stakes and metal hedgehogs that the Germans had planted to tear open landing craft. But there was no real cover, not on that open beach, and the soldiers were freezing, paralyzed by the intensity of fire, unable to move forward, unable to go back. This was the nightmare scenario that Cota had foreseen. This was the moment when the invasion could fail, when thousands of men could be trapped and destroyed on the beach, when the whole great plan could collapse into catastrophe. And this was the moment when Norman Cota did what he had come to do. He began to walk. He walked up the beach, through the fire, past the soldiers huddled behind obstacles, and his voice, calm and steady, carried over the noise of battle. "Get moving! There's only two kinds of people on this beach, the dead and those about to die, so let's get the hell out of here." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the kind of speech you'd see in a movie, but it was exactly what was needed in that moment. Because what the soldiers saw, more powerful than any words, was a general walking upright on a beach where everyone else was crouching or lying flat, walking as if the bullets weren't even there, heading toward the bluffs as if it were simply the obvious thing to do. And slowly, one by one, then in small groups, the soldiers began to follow. Smoke drifted across the sand, mixing with the spray from the waves, and in that smoke, through that chaos, men began to move forward at last. What Norman Cota did on Omaha Beach in those crucial hours wasn't particularly complicated. He walked, and he talked, and he led by example. He found soldiers pinned down behind the seawall, the low stone barrier that ran along the back of the beach, and he organized them into small groups, pointing toward the bluffs, toward those draws he had made them memorize, and telling them to go. He found engineers who were supposed to blow gaps in the beach obstacles, and discovered they had lost most of their equipment in the landing, so he helped them improvise with what they had, using Bangalore torpedoes and grenades to clear paths through the barbed wire. He found a group of rangers who had drifted off course and landed in the wrong sector, and he attached them to a unit of the 116th. Telling their captain to lead them up the bluff by whatever route looked promising. And always, he kept moving, kept showing the men that forward was possible, that the Germans could be reached, that the bluffs could be climbed. There's a famous photograph, taken sometime that morning, showing soldiers crouched behind the seawall, and if you look carefully you can see officers moving among them, organizing them, pushing them forward. And though you can't identify individuals in the grainy black and white image, Norman Cota was there, doing exactly that work. By mid-morning, small groups had begun to reach the draws, to fight their way up the narrow valleys, engaging German positions at close range with rifles and grenades, and slowly, incredibly slowly, the deadlock on the beach began to break. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. There was no single moment when the battle turned, but rather 100 small victories, 100 moments when exhausted soldiers chose to stand up and move forward instead of staying pinned down, when they followed the example set by officers who were willing to lead from the front. And while Cota wasn't the only officer showing such leadership that day, while many others also performed acts of extraordinary courage on Omaha Beach, his presence in those first crucial hours, his calm authority, and his simple insistence that forward was the only option, helped prevent the landing from becoming a complete disaster. By afternoon, the first American soldiers had reached the top of the bluffs and were pushing inland. By evening, engineers had cleared several exits and vehicles were beginning to move off the beach, and by nightfall, though the situation remained precarious, it was clear that Omaha Beach would hold. The cost had been terrible, more than 2,000 American casualties on that single beach, but the invasion had succeeded, the foothold in France had been established, and the long road to Berlin could begin. Norman Cota survived D-Day. He survived the entire war, and afterward he received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on Omaha Beach, though he rarely spoke about it, preferring to credit the courage of the soldiers rather than his own decisions. He retired from the Army in 1946, lived quietly in Pennsylvania, and died in 1971. Remembered by those who served with him as a steady hand in chaos, as the kind of leader who didn't need to make speeches because his actions spoke clearly enough. And on summer evenings now, if you walk along Omaha Beach at low tide, when the sand stretches wide and the waves roll in gently from the channel, you can still see the landscape much as it was that morning, still imagine those young men struggling ashore, still feel the weight of what happened there, when one general's careful preparation and simple courage helped save the most important day of the 20th century. The tide comes in, and goes out, and the years pass, and the story remains, floating gently now into your dreams, as you drift toward sleep, beneath the same stars that shone on that distant June morning, so long ago. And so we'll leave the story there, with the beach slowly quieting, with victory uncertain but possible, with one man's steady leadership making all the difference. Let these images drift through your mind as you fall asleep: the gray water, the smoke across the sand, the courage of ordinary soldiers, the quiet determination of one general who understood that sometimes history turns on simple acts of bravery. Sleep well, rest peacefully, and let the past fade gently into your dreams. Good night.